Good evening, everybody. This is Corey Ramsden from Solar United Neighbors. I'm here with Sam Polino, our Director of Co-ops, and we're here to present the second of two in the series we've done today on storage. These are the first two info sessions we've done this way. We're doing them in a webinar format to make sure that anybody in the state can attend. And we're doing this in support of our new Maryland storage co-op that we're running that just opened up recently. That has about 30 people in it so far. So thanks for coming. We're going to take about 40 to 45 minutes to go over some information with you. We'll have lots of opportunity for Q&A. Please, in the next slide, I'll explain that a little bit more, but please feel free to ask your questions along the way, like we do with our regular solar info sessions. This particular presentation was designed specifically for Maryland because of the co-op, but the majority of the slides are applicable broadly, except for some state-specific information on incentives. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. A couple of housekeeping items. As I said, it'll be about 45 minutes plus some time for questions. Go ahead and use the feature on your chat bar, your webinar bar there that says Q&A, and Sam is going to record those and we'll ask those at the appropriate time. Depending on your question, we might ask you to hold those questions until later on in the presentation, but feel free to shoot them off to us whenever you like. And we will be posting a recording of the webinar and the slides on the website afterwards, and we'll follow up to everybody who registered with all that information. Before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about who we are. If anybody's been to an info session, a solar info session, this will seem pretty familiar. But we do think it's important to kind of cover a little bit about what we are and why we're doing this. So Solar United Neighbors is a nonprofit. We have been around for a number of years, and really what we are is a network of people who are helping each other install solar to start with and generate their own electricity. And really what we're doing here is just expanding that work that we've done with homeowners throughout Maryland and throughout 8 other locations across the eastern United States, and now in Minnesota as well, and Florida, and helping them use their collective buying power to go solar in a group, or in this case storage, and support each other throughout the process and have us support them as well. So we've been doing this for a number of years now, and as you can see, we've got programs all up and down the East Coast and outside as well. So how did we get started? One of the things that we like to talk about a little bit is just kind of the history of where we ended up and how we started this program. And back in 2007, the kid on the left there is our executive director's son. Her name is Anya Schoolman, and she founded Community Power Network, which ultimately became Solar United Neighbors. And that started really with her son asking if they could go solar. They did some research, they tried to figure out what was possible, and they ultimately discovered that there was a lot of confusion there, so they tried to do it as a group. She tasked the boys with trying to find other people in the neighborhood who wanted to go solar as well. They knocked on doors, they handed out flyers, and before you knew it, they had about 40 people in the group, and they did that together. That became what was known as the Mount Pleasant Solar Cooperative. And really what we're doing here is a very similar type of arrangement where we're using the power of the group to go install storage together and educate each other along the way. Back then, there were only 2 companies working in DC to install solar. They told the people who were in the group kind of different things about how to install it, about the issues, about cost, equipment, taxes, etc. Okay, so Sam's telling us that our internet connection is not so good right now. I'm going to pause a little bit here and see if the slides will catch up. If other folks are having trouble hearing, please send us a chat there or a Q&A question. We want to make sure everybody's able to hear our audio here. It was fine for the first presentation. Hopefully it'll clear up here. So going back to this, how to get started, the group ran into a lot of issues, and ultimately they had to work those out together through that process. And really what we're doing here is very similar. Where storage is right now, it's kind of where solar was back then, with a lot of questions, not a lot of people who have done it yet, and that's why we're doing this as a group. The presentation tonight is going to be in 3 parts: technology, economics, and our co-op process. First part, technology. Before we go too far into it, we really want to make sure people understand that in Maryland, what we're talking about here is backup power. Energy storage can do many different things, from providing backup power to supporting the expansion of renewables on the grid. But it's really important to understand that right now in Maryland, the only thing that energy storage like batteries is going to do is provide the backup power, and it's not going to make you any money. So it's not like solar where it's reducing your cost of electricity. In fact, if you have solar, you're going to use a little bit of that solar to keep those batteries topped off and ready to go. And when the grid goes out, you're actually going to be powering part of your house off of those batteries instead of using a generator and as an alternative, for example. But really important that this is about backup power. So we just want to make that super clear for people. If you're thinking about backup power, part of what you want to consider is the cost, but also is the fuel that you're using to power that generator, or that source of backup electricity. So if you're thinking about a standard generator or fossil fuel power generator, it's probably a good idea to get some quotes on that and compare that to the price. It probably is going to be more cost effective than battery storage, but you're also providing fuel for that generator and obviously reliant on that source to keep it running. If you're powering your home and in the event of a utility outage from batteries with solar, your fuel is the sun and you're using that solar power to recharge your batteries. So just depends on what your motivations are. We do want to make sure that people do understand that a traditional generator is also an option if you're looking for backup power, and you should investigate that so you can compare them. So what kind of things are batteries going to power in your house? The batteries are really only going to come on when the power goes out, right? You're going to maintain them with that energy from the grid and from your solar panels to keep them ready, but they're only really operating when the power goes out, and they're going to kick in seamlessly. You're not going to see anything flicker or anything. It's very consistent. It comes on very fast. But it's really uneconomical for people to power their entire homes on batteries right now. So you're likely going to need to choose what you want to run in an outage. What usually will happen is that you're going to install a critical loads or a backup loads subpanel. The installer will help you with that. They're going to take care of that, and they're going to work with you to identify which circuits you want to run in your home when there's no grid power. When that power from the grid goes out, your battery system will disconnect that subpanel from the rest of your home and from the grid, and it's going to run those loads on the battery power until the grid comes back. So part of what you want to think about at this point is, what do you really want to run when you don't have electricity? Obviously, people want to run everything, but realistically, you're going to have to make some choices about what you'd actually like to power with your battery system. So here's an example. Energy storage right now, as we said, is about backup power. That means when the power goes out, you're going to run that power from your batteries. How much is going to depend on how much space you have, how much your budget is, and the arrangement that how much power you want to actually cover for your home, right? So it's really common for homeowners to over-expect how much they can run on their energy storage system. Because energy storage like batteries is still expensive, like I mentioned earlier, you're probably only going to really power the important stuff. So here's an example of what somebody might choose. This is probably only a couple circuits in your house, but it's powering some key loads like refrigeration for food, maybe some small cooking appliances, some lights, a couple of outlets to power things around your house, like cell phone chargers and maybe a television or whatever you'd like to do. And the installer will help you design a system that's going to meet those needs. What it's probably not going to power economically are more intensive electric loads, like an electric stove or a dryer or hot water heater or potentially other things. One other thing that I don't have on this slide here that I should probably mention is, in certain parts of the state or in other states, you might actually be also powering a well pump, for example. So if you have water on your property that's coming from a well, you might think that is a critical load and want to power that too. But most important takeaway here is you have to make some choices, and you're going to work that through with your installer. How does this work with solar? So the people in this group already have solar on their homes who have joined this co-op, but there's a couple different ways that can work, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But the main takeaway here really is that just like a generator, when the power goes out, your batteries are going to kick in, right? So there's no need to flip switches or anything. The power just comes on instantaneously and powers the part of your house that you've chosen to run off those batteries. The solar is going to charge your batteries by day and also powers your house when there's excess energy, when the grid's out. The batteries power your house at night and when there's not enough solar power to meet your house needs during the day. Once the grid comes back up, the batteries shut off, your solar array is going to continue to produce electricity and you'll export it when you have made too much, just like you're doing now in that normal arrangement. So all of that happens very, very seamlessly. But at the end of the day, if you have solar with storage, you're using that solar as fuel for your storage when you are in an outage and to keep them ready to go. So how is this sized? One of the things that we try to make sure people, we want people to take away from this presentation and ones like it is just a general comfort level with some of the terminology that they might interact with an installer on so that they're more educated consumers. In order to size storage, there's two pieces that they're going to take into consideration in terms of the capacity for that storage. One is how much it can hold, so that's kilowatt hours. That's how much energy is actually stored in the battery. The second is how much can it run or how much power it can produce at any given time. So that's its ability to run a number of things simultaneously. So for example, if you had a microwave and a bunch of lights and your toaster and you all had them on at the same time, that would draw more power than if you just ran the toaster and then ran the microwave after that and then did something else, right? They might all use the same amount of energy when you've used them all, but the amount of power you needed at that moment is going to be different. So it's important to just kind of understand that at a basic level. Also, though, your installer is going to help you size your system appropriately based on what you want, how much space you have, and your budget. Some more terms here for folks, especially relevant if you already have solar, like a lot of people in this group, are the two different ways that batteries are going to connect to your home, right? So there's two main ways that this happens, where you're connecting the batteries to the solar array and to the main electrical system of the house. Most battery systems that are installed where solar is already in place are going to be by what they call AC coupling. That's not necessarily always true, but that's usually a straightforward path. And what that means is that the battery system is connected to your main electric system separately from how your solar is connected to your main electric system. And they work together, but they're not actually, the batteries are not behind or connected to the solar array directly. The second way is if you're installing solar all at once, or if you decide to upgrade or modify your existing solar array, you might do something called DC coupling. And in that example on the right, you are putting the batteries behind the solar inverter and using that energy from the solar to charge the batteries directly. So part of this is the design and what's possible with your system and your components for your existing solar array, but part of it is also the impact of incentives potentially. So we'll talk about this a little more later, but it's likely going to be easier to justify the 30% federal tax credit with a DC coupled system than AC. It's not clear cut, but we'll as I said, we'll come back to that, but that's some important terminology to keep in mind. This gets technical pretty quick. So just at a high level, important thing here is, again, the installer is going to understand with you what you need to do, how much you want to cover with batteries, but also what conditions you already have in your home in terms of your existing solar system, and come up with the right solution. Looks like we've got a question here.
So just quickly, Adam asked, which is the Tesla Powerwall, AC coupled or DC coupled?
Question is whether the Tesla Powerwall is AC coupled or DC coupled. Adam, my understanding is that it's actually, it can support both. I think it depends on the model, but I believe you can install the Powerwall in either mode. That the installer is going to obviously do that for you. but I believe it supports both. That's not always true. Not all batteries are going to be able to do that immediately, but the installer usually has some flexibility there in terms of how they put those components together. They might need to add components to do it, but they usually have some ability to meet that to the needs of the house. Any other questions? Okay. So let's talk about the technologies that are out there. Lots of different battery technologies out there. If you've done any reading at all, you'll probably have seen a ton of different acronyms. We're trying to boil it down here to kind of the simplest terms, which is that there are two main technologies that you're going to encounter. On the left is lead acid. They've been around for a long time. The costs are less upfront, and they can be a great form of backup power. Lithium ion on the right is newer. It lasts longer. It also comes, in most cases, with better warranties, but it also costs more upfront, and obviously is a newer technology for this purpose. So maybe some less certainty from installers and from others about how to install it, but this technology is also, the prices are dropping, and there's a lot of excitement and work that's being done around lithium ion right now. We want you to know the different options that are out there. Don't worry about becoming an expert in them, but it is important to know that depending on the installer you work with, they may offer one or both, and they may, after talking to you, recommend one technology over another based on the conditions in your house or your setup. And we just want folks to be aware of some of the differences between them. Now, there are other technologies available out there. We're not covering them here because from what we've seen in our research, these are really the two that are most common in the marketplace right now. One thing we'll do as part of the co-op is obviously ask which technologies and which offerings are available from that installer, and that'll be part of the selection process as well. So we'll come back to that when we talk about the co-op, but this is certainly part of that conversation. So let's talk about space requirements. On the left here, you see a racked system of lead acid batteries. You can see there's 3 rows that are connected together. That's how these systems are created. They're often assembled to meet a specific amount of energy that a home is looking to offset during backups. And they can be very custom in that regard. Very heavy equipment, it's going to be on shelving or on the floor, and sometimes needs to be located in a specific part of your house based on electrical codes. They might also require more space than the lithium-ion options because they typically require more space to cover the same amount of electricity. On the right-hand side, you see just an example. These are Tesla batteries. We've got some images of other ones in here as well from other manufacturers. But the lithium-ion units are usually going to be a single box, or sometimes a couple of them connected together, that are going to be wall or floor mounted. Where they go depends a little bit on the conditions in your house, which is a good segue to our next slide. So siting conditions. Batteries generally are going to function best when they're in a controlled environment. By that we mean where the temperature is within a reasonable range. It's not too hot, not too cold. And that's part of that design process that the installer is going to go through with you. Where can they go in your house? If they need to be outside, which technologies can I put outside? For example, some lithium-ion battery units are rated to be outside. The Tesla Powerwall, for example, and the LG Chem, I think are both rated to be outside, but they might not all be. So that's part of what they're going to have to work through with you. Based on that space, that's going to determine to some degree, depending if you have limited space, how big your system is going to be. Some situations, there's also venting required. Part of that is determined by local building codes, but for sealed batteries, for sealed lead acid batteries, typically that's not an issue. However, we do want to bring that up because when it comes to municipal codes, it's not always clear necessarily at the code level what those requirements are, locally. So that's something that we'll talk about in a minute a little bit more. Warranties across the board here, I think we could say that lithium-ion batteries typically have a longer warranty than lead acid batteries, which is certainly helpful, but they're also a newer technology, so it's not clear necessarily what their lifespan is for some of these units, but they are warranted for 10 years. and sometimes also include an additional component to their warranty that covers the number of cycles. So by cycle, we mean when the battery is discharged and then gets recharged, that's considered a cycle. So even if you use just a little bit and recharge it, that's a cycle. If you draw down a lot of energy from the battery and recharge it, that's a cycle. The batteries are built to withstand a certain number of those. Lead acid batteries typically have more cycles they support than, lithium ion batteries generally have more cycles they can support than lead acid batteries. But in backup situations, it's not a big concern necessarily because you're only using them in case of emergency. Some other considerations here. Insurance. If you've ever seen one of our info sessions for solar, you'll have heard us say this before. Always a good idea to call your insurance company, let them know what you're doing, and see whether there's an impact to you. For solar, we can say there's typically not an impact in terms of cost. For batteries, we just don't know yet. So if you've called your insurance company already, please share that with us. We'd love to know and happy to share that with the group. If not, we do recommend that you give them a ring, explain to them what you're thinking about doing, and get a sense of whether you need to change your insurance policy at all to cover that. For permitting, we want to make sure that folks are aware that this is relatively new for permitting officials as well, right? So we should be prepared that there might be some snags during that process. Your installer is going to navigate that with you, but permitting officials, just like they did with solar years ago, in many places, are going to need to understand and figure this out to some degree. So there might be additional steps involved or some additional review or questions along the way. That's another reason why doing this as a group is helpful, especially if people are in the same area, because then we can compare notes and potentially try to resolve any issues that come up. Utility requirements are not clear because this is backup power, so there really shouldn't be any need for utility approval, but that's something that we'll have to discover through this initial co-op, is whether or not there is any sort of approval required from the utility company. And the installer, again, will help navigate through that, as will we, as we potentially run into any issues. But our initial expectation is there shouldn't actually be any utility approval required because you're not feeding energy back to the grid. You're just providing it to the house when it's disconnected from the grid in the event of an outage. Installer qualifications. Installers typically do not have a lot of experience with batteries in this area just because they have not been all that popular. Some are going to have more than others. Even if you're not going solar or installing storage with the group, it's a good idea to ask what their qualifications are, how many they've done, what battery technologies they've installed before, just to get a sense of, and where in the state, and to get a sense of what kind of experience they have. Just the way you would with any other contractor. Equipment availability. What do I mean by this? Lithium ion in particular, this is less true for lead acid batteries, but lithium ion batteries, they're relatively new. There is increasing demand, and there is some indication that there may be some supply issues. That's something we will be asking in the RFP for this co-op, but you also directly, in talking to installers, want to make sure you understand for the units that you're interested in, can they actually source them in a reasonable period of time? Is there a wait list, for example? And just to give you a real life example, in Florida, we have a program. The Miami coordinator down there had an interaction with some folks who work for the city who essentially shared that there are some shortages for Tesla Powerwalls there because the dealers, they're all being redirected to Puerto Rico for disaster recovery. So even though there are people who want those batteries in Florida, it's very difficult to find them right now because the distribution channels are sending them elsewhere. So end of the day, just something we need to verify and make sure we understand what's available and what isn't. And last but not least, EVs. We're not spend a lot of time on this here, but we do want to acknowledge that in certain situations, EV owners have and potentially can use their electric vehicles as a backup generator potentially. And that if you decide to do that, if you own an EV, just make sure you research your options carefully to make sure that you can do this safely and that you understand if there's any impact to your warranty for the vehicle. But we have heard a couple of examples for people who have done this in a pinch as a generator for their home in an outage. There are lots of great EV resources out here. If you're interested in finding out more there, feel free to follow up with us and or the local EV club in your area. There are lots of enthusiastic EV owners who are ready to help if you want to do that. So I'm going to pause here just for a minute, see if we have any other questions from the group. Sam's shaking his head no. Looks like we're covering all the bases. If you do, please feel free to fire away during the group or after.
And just to remind folks, we're unable to unmute participants currently, so if you could type your questions into the actual Q&A questions box, that would be very helpful for us, and then I'll be able to raise them to Corey and help answer them as quickly as possible.
So just to reiterate that, please type them into that Q&A box so we can get those questions answered. All right, let's move on to economics. If you have a tech question during economics, feel free to type it in too. We're happy to go back and cover that if you didn't get a chance to ask. Installing storage with and without solar. So this group already has solar for this co-op, but we do want to point out some of the differences here as far as whether you're installing it with solar or afterwards. On the left, if you're installing it with solar, a couple things that might be at play here that are worth considering. One is if you don't have solar yet and you're doing it together, there may be a benefit there to reducing some of the costs. It's not guaranteed, but for contractors who are already coming to your house, there may be some savings there if they're doing it all together. Second is the eligibility for the federal tax credit. And I will explain this more in detail at a later slide, but installing storage with solar might make that a little bit easier. Doesn't mean that it's not possible if you install storage later, but it certainly can make it more straightforward in some cases. So if you're installing storage later on, you've already got solar, it does give you the opportunity to see whether prices are going to fall. Most likely, systems that have solar who are install storage afterwards are probably going to use that, what I refer to as AC coupling, which means that the system is going to be connected to your electric system and not directly to your solar system. And they'll work together, but they won't be directly electrically connected. That typically provides an easier path for people, but it does create some uncertainty on the eligibility for that federal tax credit on solar. And as I said, I'll come back to that in a later slide in a little more detail. One other thing about installing it later that I should point out is that in some situations, you might need additional equipment, or you might even need to replace your current inverter. That's something the installer is going to work out with you based on what you currently have, but you may decide that it's worth it to do that in order to make sure the system functions optimally by swapping out your existing solar inverter. That's not necessarily a requirement as from what we understand, but it is a possibility. So we do want to bring that up and make sure that people know that that's a possibility when they're talking to their installer. Let's talk a little bit about pricing. We tried to come up with a way to show this that makes sense and breaks it down into some components here. There's a lot of coverage on storage out there, and a lot of numbers get thrown around that are really the cost of the storage unit itself, the batteries, that don't incorporate necessarily the full installation cost. So what we tried to do here is just kind of break that out a little bit. The hardware, when we say hardware, we mean the actual batteries themselves. When we talk about installation, that's all the work the installer is doing to assemble those parts and any additional equipment that might be needed. So just for example, depending on the battery chemistry you choose and the brand, there may or may not be an inverter that's bundled with the battery. If that battery doesn't have an inverter, the installer is going to need to select one and pair it with that battery, so that's an additional cost. And then this last piece here, lifetime maintenance, this is really our attempt to really just accommodate the fact that this is relatively new technology still, and it's possible that in a couple of years you might need to call your installer back or someone else to come service the unit or find out if you're having a problem. So this is just a catch-all to kind of acknowledge that that is possibly more likely than it is with solar, for example, where it's very low maintenance and there's usually not a lot that needs to be done. So some pricing examples here just to kind of put a little more meat on the bones. The hardware costs on the left, these are our attempt to kind of track these costs down from manufacturer information. They're probably not 100% correct, but we tried to get as close as we could. Installation costs seem like they're a little high, $3,000 to $5,000. We might find that they're less, but we didn't want to, we tried to be conservative here because this, again, potentially includes the cost of an additional inverter depending on which option you choose. So there's going to be some wide variation there, but we came up with around $10,000 to $12,000. We're putting it at 11 as kind of an average cost for one of these systems. How much it is for you, again, depends on how much you're trying to cover, whether you need multiple units or whether you're just using a single unit, and so a bunch of other factors. So lots to learn here as far as the pricing, but we'll find that out during the co-op as well. And then lastly, this just kind of catch-all for maintenance that we think at least we should consider, folks should consider if they're moving forward, because that might be something that they have to take advantage of later on, a couple years down the road. Last, here, I just want to kind of reinforce again, and we talked about this at the beginning, but really important that folks understand what we're talking about here is backup power, right? So your system is not going to, your battery system is not going to create value for you in Maryland right now because of the way the electricity laws and tariffs are set up. It's really just replacing electricity when the grid is out, and that's it. So just want to reiterate that point. It doesn't mean that in the future that condition won't change, but right now that is what it is. Looks like we got a question here.
And this is a good segue, Corey. Libby, or not a segue, but just an anecdote here. Libby in the chat asked, or just raised the point of time of use rates and kind of gave an example. Again, I just responded as this is currently unavailable in Maryland right now, but maybe we could just mention that briefly of how a time of use rate might function in the future.
Yep. So the question was about time of use rates, and just a quick clarification, there are a couple of places where time of use rates are available in Maryland. Some of them are not actively available to join, some are, but from what I've seen, the difference between the high rate and the low rate is probably not enough to make a big difference in terms of the economics for batteries. And for folks out there who aren't familiar, time of use is when the cost of electricity is going to be different at a certain point of the day versus another time of day or another time of the week. So in that situation, which is true in other parts of the country, you could use batteries to change when you use grid power and essentially move your use of that power to when the electricity was cheapest. But as I said, in Maryland, that's not widespread, and it's not clear even for those time of use plans whether there's a significant economic value there. If you are on a time of use plan, definitely mention that to your installer. That might change the economics a little bit for you, but we want to make sure folks understand that at this point we don't expect that's a significant factor in the economics for it. Great question, Libby. Any other questions before we move on?
Libby followed up with MBPSC is preparing a residential time of day rule rate, maybe here in a year or two.
Yeah. Yeah, so thanks, Libby, for that follow-up. Yeah, there are some things that are being considered. There'll probably be pilots to start with, so it's going to be something that we'll have to keep our eyes on, whether there's a benefit there to switch. But at this point, it's still kind of an open question where that's going to end up. So let's go back to this tax credit here. From what we've been able to gather from our research and from talking to folks in the industry, as well as some recent reports in Green Tech Media, it looks like the federal tax credit can be made available for storage, even if the storage is installed after solar is installed, but with a very important distinct characteristic here, and that is that the storage is actually charged at least 75% from the solar energy. Now, this goes back to our description earlier of AC coupled versus DC coupled. If you remember, DC coupled is when the batteries are behind the solar inverter and they're all kind of in one place electrically. In that situation, it's much easier to demonstrate that your batteries are being charged from solar, and that tax credit would be much easier to take clearly. I will say we're not accountants, not tax advisors. Please definitely consult professional help on this, but we want to kind of learn through this together with people. This is our current understanding of it. For systems that are AC coupled, where it's probably going to be harder to show that that energy is coming from the solar array as opposed to the grid, there's some more doubt about whether or not being able to take the tax credit is possible. It doesn't mean that it's out of the question, but that's something that we need to investigate further as we move forward in this co-op, is talking to installers and also potentially talking to folks who have already potentially gone solar through this route. Sorry, have installed storage through this route. So main takeaway here is if it's available, this is obviously a big benefit for folks, whether they're doing it when they install solar and storage together or if they install storage later. But there is some uncertainty about all the conditions in which you can take this tax credit. And just for reference here as well, for folks that aren't familiar, this tax credit is at 30% until 2019, and then it steps down to 26% the next year, and then 22% after that. So right now, you still have access to the full tax credit if you qualify. Something that's really exciting that's happened recently in Maryland is that Maryland is, I think, one of the few, it may be the only state in the nation, I think we've just added maybe another state that's done this, is the storage tax credit that they passed last year. It's available in 2018 through the Maryland Energy Administration. It's 30% of the installed cost, up to $5,000. And some clarification, we had somebody ask a question earlier today, if you install a system in 2018, can you apply in 2019? And the answer is no, according to the rules on the MEA site. Something else that is a little bit of a challenge is that you have to have completed the system and have proved that it was inspected and fully completed before you can apply for the tax credit. There's a limited amount of funds available. Approximately $225,000 have been allocated for residential credits. The credit program is going to go on for 3 years. But for this year, you would need to have your system installed and then apply for that credit and get the credit issued this year and then take it for this tax year. So there's some uncertainty there. We want people to be aware of that. They will maintain a waiting list within this year because there's another pool of money available for the commercial projects. So there's a chance that if the residential pool gets used up, there might be some left over, but the commercial projects are probably going to go quickly. So we want folks to, to be aware that there's a chance they may not get the credit. That's all the more reason for us to go through this co-op quickly and try to move things along so folks have an opportunity. We did also talk to MEA and ask them whether they'd be updating information on how much is left. And they did say that they plan to keep a tally updated on the available credits money remaining through the course of the year. So we'll definitely keep track of that during the co-op and try to make sure folks understand, relatively speaking, how much is left and whether or not they have a shot at getting this credit. So if you combine the federal credit and the Maryland credit, and you're eligible for both, that's 60% of your system cost. So that's obviously pretty significant. Even without the federal credit, 30% still is quite a bit of a chunk there for a system. So we're eager to see people take advantage of this credit for this group. I'm going to pause here just for a second. If anybody has any questions about economics or the incentives, definitely speak up now. And if not, we'll go on to our co-ops. All right. Some of these, at least one of these slides in here, you may have seen before if you've come to one of our info sessions. We, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've done a lot of solar co-ops. We think this model is helpful for storage as well. So we're really eager to help people figure this out together. And we hope if you haven't joined already, you'll consider joining the storage co-op. This is the first one we've ever done. And we're really just excited to see where it goes. This presentation and all of these materials is all stuff that we've put together recently to try to help people figure this out as a group. Looks like we've got a question.
Yeah, just before we move on to the co-op process, Bob's asking, is the process for applying clearly delineated on the MEA website, and who can navigate that?
Thanks, Bob. That's a good. So Bob asked a question about the process for applying for the credit. The MEA website does have good information on there with the application materials. It's all clearly described, and there's a link on our storage co-op webpage to that site. So I do recommend people go to that. It's solarunitedneighbors.org/mdstorage. I'll show that link again at the end of the presentation. We link to the MEA site there, and it has all the application materials all spelled out there, as well as the eligibility criteria. So you've probably seen this slide before. This is our standard slide we use. That's why it still says solar on it, since we haven't updated it for storage. But the process is very similar, right? We're learning about the co-op and about storage. So that's what you're doing tonight. We're going to record these webinars, encourage everybody in the group to watch this webinar and to try to get some base education for people about storage, excuse me, as part of this group. If you haven't signed up yet and you're interested, you want to do that on the website. I will have a link at the end of the presentation. Ask some basic questions, and that will put you into the storage co-op, and we'll start communicating with you about the rest of the process to go install storage as a group. And then third, obviously, if you know other people, we welcome having anybody join the group so that we can kind of get the maximum benefit from folks who are interested. For people who aren't familiar, step 4 here, select an installer. The co-ops that we run are actually driven by the people in the group. So we provide administrative support and facilitation, but ultimately the group selects the installer that's going to work with them. Now, how does that work? We will solicit from anybody in the group who is interested to become a volunteer on the selection committee. Totally optional, but we usually get 5 to 8 people who are willing to do that work. We'll solicit bids from any installation company who wants to provide it to us in the area. If you know of companies that you want to make sure see that bid, please tell us. We'll collate those bids and summarize them and then share them with the group. We'll all sit down and spend about 2 to 3 hours going over them. And then at the end, the volunteers in that selection committee will select a single installer to work with the entire group. Once that happens, Solar United Neighbors will be there to follow the process along all the way through until everyone's completed. That involves doing check-in calls with the installer, answering questions from the homeowners and from the installer to keep things moving smoothly. Each person will get visited by the selected installer, and they will provide a custom proposal for you that reflects the group pricing that has been agreed upon and selected by that selection committee. Once you sign your contract, we think it's going to be a couple of months until the system is fully installed. That's something we're actually eager to know more about. Solar usually takes about 3 to 5 months. We think it might be a little shorter for storage, maybe somewhere around 2 to 3 months. But that's something that we will find out in this process. And then at the end, we would love to have a party and celebrate with everybody about all the work that we're doing. This is, we think, maybe the first of its kind. At least we certainly have never done a storage co-op before. If anybody knows of other organizations doing this across the country, let us know, because we think we're doing something that maybe people haven't tried before. I think we covered a lot of this already. Who can participate and some specifics, but I just want to reiterate here, this co-op is specifically for people who already have solar. We're trying to limit the level of complexity here, so we decided to go for folks who are already solar homeowners. We were really excited to see a number of people who joined the group or who have gone solar through our co-ops. So this is kind of seems like the next step for them, and we think that's great. And we've got about 30, I think 29 people who have joined the group so far. This is for folks who are looking to install backup power for their house in an outage. Anybody can join the group who's an owner in Maryland. And we do want to stress this is a pilot. We're figuring this out together, but we feel like we've got a pretty good structure here, and we're ready to learn with everybody in the group about how this goes. As far as participating and why, I think the big impact for people, aside from maybe some competitive pricing that we hope to see in the bidding, is really just that security of understanding how this works as a group, collectively identifying problems that people encounter and trying to work through it as a group that's bigger than just one person who's trying to navigate it on their own. That's one of the reasons we see a lot of people interested in our solar co-ops, and we think that same dynamic will be applicable here. Timeline, we are really looking forward to putting out an RFP sometime in the next couple of, probably the next week or so, week or two. We have designed a basic one based on the one we use for our solar co-ops. We need to circulate it with some installers to get some feedback, make sure we're asking the right questions. If you are interested in taking a look at it and want to provide feedback, please let us know. I've got some contact info on the last slide. And if you're interested in serving in the selection committee, also give us a shout. We'd love to have you participate. We hope to have an installer selected by the end of April, and then get installations completed as soon as we can after that, so folks can try to take advantage of that tax credit. If you're interested in joining the group, or if you just want to see information about it, we'll also post the slides and the recording of this webinar at the link you see on the presentation there, solarunitedneighbors.org/mdstorage. Email address there is also one where you can reach us to ask questions about this presentation or about the co-op. Please feel free to reach out if you think of a question later on. We also greatly encourage people to tell us feedback on this presentation. We've only done this one twice, and we would very much want to make sure that the information that we're presenting is useful for people, it's at the right level, and that we're giving people some value. So please do tell us how it went. We're not afraid to hear good and bad feedback, so let us know. And then last here, you see this join the listserv. If you come to the website, you'll see some links there to join the Maryland listserv, and it's a great resource for people for solar, and we expect it will become one for storage as well. There's about 700 plus people on that list who are ready to answer questions for people and generally support others who are interested in distributed energy resources in Maryland. So I'm going to pause there for a minute. I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining tonight, and we'll keep the lines open for questions here. If anybody has any, technical or otherwise, please feel free to fire away. It doesn't sound like we have any questions. We'll stick around for another minute or two if you change your mind. But otherwise, thank you all very much for joining, and look for a follow-up email from us with all of this information about where you can join the co-op and the location for the recordings and the slides, probably in the next day or two. Thank you very much, everybody.
It sounds like one quick question here from Bob is less of a question, more request for assistance. It said he went to the MEA page and cannot seem to download the FOA document. Any insight there for me?
Thanks, Bob. So it sounds like Bob was having trouble finding the information on the MEA page. I am not familiar with that error, but I think what we'll do is we can follow up directly, and we'll share that information when we send out the follow-up email to everybody on the link, just to make sure everybody knows where to find that info.
And then one other question we're getting is about, will batteries be configured to allow operations during nighttime?
The question is about whether batteries will be configured to enable operation during the night. Lithium-ion batteries in particular, compared with the right inverter, will allow you to do that. That's part of what we were talking about earlier with being able to manage your electricity costs. There's really no reason to do that in Maryland right now, but technologically speaking, you can certainly configure the system to collect energy in the day, draw from the batteries at night, priority, and then charge them up again in the daytime. Again, there's no economic value for that in Maryland, but that technology, there's no reason not to. In places like Hawaii and California, where there are reasons to do that, that's exactly what they do, and that's called self-consumption, and they will, the batteries play an important role in that.
And one last question, I believe, from Jody. She's a question about if you find out about the tax credits before or after you've signed a contract. So good question. So that question is whether you find out about the tax credits. I assume you mean the Maryland tax credit before or after you sign a contract. Unfortunately, the way the Maryland program was structured by the MEA, you have to fully install, i.e. fully pay for your system before you can apply for the tax credit. Definitely not ideal. There's some risk there, but that is the way that they decided to design the program. So we just want folks to make sure they understand that if you install a system and you pay for it, there is at least a possibility you will not get the Maryland tax credit because of the way the program is structured. Sounds like that might have been our last question. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. And as I said earlier, please send us some feedback. Let us know how we did. Take care and have a great night.